Mein Gott, I'll never forget the evening of December 24th, 1944, when I stood shivering in a freezing Belgian field surrounded by barbed wire, expecting nothing but cold misery for Christmas, only to hear 1,000 American soldiers begin singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, first in English, then joined by hundreds of German prisoners singing in our native tongue, creating a moment of grace that transcended the hatred and violence that had defined our last 3 weeks of desperate combat. The winter wind was howling across the Ardennes, carrying snow that mixed with the smoke from distant artillery, and somewhere in the darkness, I could hear both American and German voices rising together in a carol that belonged to no army, but to all humanity. I was Feldwebel Ernst Iron Wolf Hoffmann, 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, and after 3 years of combat from the frozen hell of the Eastern Front to the desperate German offensive in the Ardennes, I thought I understood everything about warfare, about the clear distinction between friend and enemy, and about the necessity of viewing American soldiers as obstacles to be destroyed rather than as human beings with families and faiths similar to our own. I'd earned my nickname Iron Wolf through 2 years of brutal combat in Finland and Norway, where mercy was a luxury neither side could afford, had witnessed atrocities that hardened my heart against any enemy, and genuinely believed that soldiers fought best when they hated their opponents completely. But what happened during that Christmas Eve in an American prisoner compound would shatter every assumption I'd held about the nature of warfare, about the possibility for humanity to survive even the most desperate conflicts, and about whether enemies could recognize each other's common heritage through something as simple as a shared song. Those American soldiers would teach me that culture and faith could transcend national boundaries, that music could create bridges where words failed, and that sometimes the enemy you'd been trying to kill just days earlier could remind you of why you'd once believed war was supposed to end, so people could return home to the lives they'd left behind. My journey to that moment of unexpected grace began on December 16, 1944, when our division participated in Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive in the West, designed to split Allied forces and recapture Antwerp. Kameraden, announced Hauptsturmführer Karl Weber during our final briefing before the attack, this is Germany's final opportunity to achieve victory in the West. We will attack through the Ardennes with overwhelming force, destroy American positions before they can reinforce, and drive to the English Channel. Success means Germany survives. Failure means total defeat. His assessment was accurate, though perhaps more optimistic than circumstances warranted. We all understood that Germany was losing the war, that Soviet forces were advancing from the east, while Americans and British pressed from the west, and that this offensive represented a gamble of our remaining military strength on one decisive blow. But we were soldiers trained to follow orders and to fight with maximum effectiveness, regardless of strategic hopelessness. The 6th SS Mountain Division had been bloodied on the Eastern Front, where we'd learned to survive conditions and combat intensity that made Western Front operations seem almost gentle by comparison. These Americans are soft soldiers who've never experienced real combat, observed Oberscharführer Franz Müller, a veteran who'd fought from Leningrad to Stalingrad. They'll break when we hit them with proper German offensive tactics in winter conditions they're not prepared for. His confidence reflected broader German assumptions about American military capabilities, that American soldiers relied on material superiority rather than fighting spirit, that they'd perform poorly in harsh winter conditions, that German tactical excellence could overcome American numerical advantages if we achieved surprise. The initial assault on December 16th seemed to confirm these assumptions. We achieved tactical surprise, penetrated American defensive lines, and advanced rapidly through difficult terrain that Americans had assumed was impassable for major offensive operations. American units were overrun, scattered, or forced to retreat as German armor and infantry exploited breakthrough points. My company's role was to secure key road junctions that would allow German armor to advance toward Bastogne, a critical transportation hub that controlled access to roads throughout the region. We engaged scattered American units who seemed surprised by the intensity and scale of German offensive operations. "These Americans fight better than we expected," I reported to Hauptsturmführer Weber after our first day of combat. "They're not breaking and running. They're fighting delaying actions and conducting tactical retreats while maintaining unit cohesion." Weber dismissed my concerns with the confidence of an officer who'd been told this offensive would succeed. They're simply retreating in good order because they haven't yet realized how desperate their situation is. Once we encircle Bastogne and cut off American reinforcements, their resistance will collapse. But American resistance stiffened as the offensive continued, and what we'd expected to be a breakthrough turned into a grinding battle of attrition that favored the side with superior supply lines and replacement capacity. German logistics began breaking down as our advance exceeded the capacity of our supply system, while American forces received continuous reinforcement despite our best efforts to interdict their movements. The turning point for my personal war came on December 22nd, during fierce fighting for a small Belgian village, whose name I never learned. My company was ordered to clear American forces from a cluster of stone buildings that blocked our advance toward a key road junction. "Vorwärts!" I shouted to my squad as we advanced under covering fire from an MG-42 machine gun position. Drive these Americans out before they can organize proper defense. But instead of the demoralized retreat we'd expected, American soldiers fought back with determination and tactical competence that exceeded anything we'd encountered during the offensive's opening days. They used the buildings effectively for cover, coordinated their fire to create overlapping fields of fire, and held their positions despite our numerical superiority and tactical advantages. The engagement turned against us when American artillery began falling with devastating accuracy. Not the scattered harassment fire we'd experienced earlier, but concentrated barrages that suggested forward observers were directing fire with professional precision. Within minutes, my company took casualties that forced us to withdraw to positions we'd held that morning. These Americans fight like veterans, not like the green troops we were told to expect, I reported to Hauptsturmführer Weber. They're coordinating infantry, artillery, and armor in ways that suggest extensive combat experience, but my report came too late to affect my own situation. During our withdrawal from the village, American forces counterattacked and encircled what remained of my squad. We found ourselves trapped in a basement with no ammunition, no reinforcements coming, and no realistic hope of escape. "Surrender or die," called an American voice in accented German. "You fought well, but it's over. Come out with your hands visible, and you'll be treated properly." The decision to surrender was the most difficult of my military career. German soldiers were taught that surrender was dishonorable, that dying in combat was preferable to captivity, that American treatment of prisoners might be brutal despite Geneva Convention requirements. But I was also responsible for the 5 men trapped in that basement with me. Young soldiers barely out of their teens who deserved a chance to survive the war and return to their families. Continuing to fight meant certain death with no military purpose served by our sacrifice. "We surrender," I called back in my limited English. "We have wounded. We need medical treatment." The Americans who accepted our surrender were professional and correct in their treatment of prisoners, contrary to what German propaganda had taught us to expect. They disarmed us, provided first aid to our wounded, and transported us to a temporary prisoner collection point near Bastogne that was serving as a holding facility for German POWs captured during the offensive. "Welcome to your new accommodations, Fritz," said the American sergeant, processing our capture, not unkindly. "You picked a hell of a time to get captured. We got about 500 of you Krauts already, and Christmas is in 2 days. But don't worry, we'll feed you according to Geneva Convention standards." The prisoner compound was a hastily constructed facility, essentially a large field surrounded by barbed wire, with squad tents providing minimal shelter from December cold. 500 German prisoners were crammed into a space designed for perhaps 200, creating conditions that were uncomfortable, but not deliberately cruel. "At least we're alive," observed Gefreiter Hans Richter, one of the young soldiers from my squad who'd surrendered with me. "Better to be cold and uncomfortable than dead in that village." His pragmatic assessment was correct, though accepting captivity while German forces were still fighting nearby created complicated emotions. We could hear American artillery firing in support of Bastogne's defense, could see American supply trucks moving constantly despite German attempts to interdict logistics, and could observe the systematic efficiency with which American military operations functioned even during desperate combat. "These Americans have more supplies in one day than we've seen in a month," observed Obergefreiter Otto Brenner, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd been captured in the same action as my squad. "They're feeding us better as prisoners, than our own army fed us as soldiers. How are we supposed to win this war when our enemies have such overwhelming material advantages? His question reflected the growing recognition among German soldiers that we were fighting a losing battle against enemies who possessed industrial and logistical capabilities that Germany couldn't match, regardless of tactical excellence or fighting spirit. But the true transformation in my understanding of American soldiers and the nature of our shared humanity came during Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1944, when circumstances created an unexpected moment of grace that transcended the hatred defining our conflict. The day had been typical for our captivity: cold, uncomfortable, with minimal activities beyond waiting for meager meals and trying to stay warm in inadequate shelter. American guards maintained security but weren't hostile, treating us as defeated soldiers rather than as hated enemies. "Tomorrow is Christmas," said Hans wistfully as evening approached. "Last year I was home with my family in Bavaria. This year I'm a prisoner in Belgium with no idea if I'll ever see my family again." His melancholy was shared by most German prisoners. Christmas was traditionally the most important family holiday in German culture, and spending it in captivity while war continued represented profound disconnection from everything that gave meaning to our lives. But as darkness fell on Christmas Eve and temperatures dropped below freezing, something unexpected happened that would challenge every assumption I'd held about American soldiers and their capacity for recognizing shared humanity, even with enemies they'd been fighting desperately just days earlier. At approximately 1900 hours, American soldiers began assembling near our compound's perimeter, not guards maintaining security, but regular combat soldiers who'd apparently been given leave from frontline positions to observe Christmas Eve at the rear areas. Within an hour, perhaps 1,000 American soldiers had gathered in the area surrounding our prisoner compound. "What are the Americans doing?" asked Otto nervously. "Are they preparing some kind of demonstration against us? Do they plan to make us watch while they celebrate their victory?" His concerns reflected legitimate uncertainty about American intentions. But what happened next would prove that American soldiers possessed cultural depth and spiritual awareness that German propaganda had never acknowledged. Without any formal signal or announcement, the assembled American soldiers began singing, not military songs or patriotic anthems, but Christmas carols that transcended national boundaries and spoke to shared Christian heritage between enemies. "Silent Night, Holy Night," sang 1,000 American voices in English, the melody carrying across the frozen Belgian field to where we German prisoners stood listening in stunned disbelief. "All is calm, all is bright." The carol was Stille Nacht, Silent Night, originally composed in Austria and beloved by Germans for over a century as one of our most cherished Christmas traditions. But hearing it sung in English by American soldiers created complex emotions that challenged my assumptions about cultural differences between our nations. "They're singing our song," whispered Hans, tears forming in his eyes. "How do Americans know Stille Nacht?" His question revealed the gap in German understanding of American culture and the shared European heritage that connected our peoples despite political conflicts. Silent Night had become an international carol beloved by Christians throughout the Western world, representing values about peace and grace that transcended the nationalist ideologies driving our war. But the most profound moment came when American soldiers reached the carol's second verse and began singing in German. Not perfect German with proper pronunciation, but recognizable German that demonstrated someone had taught these soldiers to sing our language so they could share this moment with their German prisoners. "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht," sang the American voices haltingly but sincerely. "Alles schlaft, einsam wacht." The effect on German prisoners was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of us began weeping openly as enemy soldiers sang our Christmas carol in our native tongue, creating a moment of shared humanity that transcended the hatred and violence defining our relationship for the past week. "Join them," called out an American officer in accented German. "This night belongs to all Christians, not just to victors or vanquished. Sing with us if you know the words." His invitation created a moment of hesitation among German prisoners. Should we sing with enemies who'd defeated us? Was participating in this shared moment disloyal to our comrades still fighting? Did accepting American gesture of reconciliation represent betrayal of German military values? But the profound emotional need to connect with something larger than military conflict overcame hesitation, and German voices began joining the American singing, creating a chorus of enemies united. Temporarily through shared faith and shared cultural heritage, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Hirten erst kundgemacht, durch der Engel Halleluja tönt es laut von fern und nah, Christ, der Retter ist da, Christ, der Retter ist da. For 3 verses, Americans and Germans sang together. Enemies who'd been trying to kill each other just days earlier, united temporarily through recognition that we shared something more fundamental than the political conflicts that had driven us to war. When the carol ended, silence fell over the field that was more profound than any words could express. American soldiers and German prisoners stood looking at each other across barbed wire that separated us physically, but couldn't prevent the emotional connection we'd just experienced through shared music and shared faith. "Merry Christmas, Krauts," called the same American officer who'd invited us to sing. "Tomorrow we go back to being enemies, but tonight we're all Christians remembering why we celebrate this holiday. Sleep well, and remember that this war will end someday, and we'll all go home to our families." His words acknowledged both the reality of our continued conflict and the hope that conflict would eventually end, allowing us to return to the lives we'd left behind when our government sent us to fight each other. The impact of that Christmas Eve singing extended far beyond just one evening's emotional moment. Over the following days, as we remained in American custody and war continued around Bastogne, relationships between German prisoners and American guards evolved from purely functional interactions to something approaching mutual respect between professional soldiers. "These Americans aren't the cultural barbarians we were taught to despise," I told Otto during one of our many conversations about what we'd experienced. "They value family, faith, and tradition just like we do. They sing our songs, respect our customs, and treat us with dignity despite having every reason to hate us for the destruction our army has caused." Otto nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about Hauptsturmführer Weber's briefing before the offensive, when he told us that Americans were soft materialists without proper culture or spiritual depth. But those soldiers singing Stille Nacht in German demonstrated more spiritual awareness than most SS officers I've served under." His observation reflected growing recognition among German prisoners that propaganda about American cultural inferiority had been as false as propaganda about American military incompetence. We'd been taught that Americans were shallow people, obsessed with material comfort and lacking deeper cultural or spiritual values. But the Christmas Eve singing had demonstrated American capacity for recognizing shared humanity and shared faith, even with enemies. But perhaps the most profound transformation in my understanding came through conversations with American guards who were willing to discuss their own backgrounds and motivations for fighting this war. "Sergeant Morrison," I asked one of our regular guards through an interpreter, "why did your commanding officer arrange for American soldiers to sing German Christmas carols with their prisoners? This seems inconsistent with normal military discipline and separation between captors and captives." Morrison's response revealed American values about human dignity and the proper treatment even of enemies. "Hoffman, our captain believes that German soldiers are human beings who deserve to celebrate Christmas with dignity, even in captivity. Yeah, you guys were trying to kill us last week and we were trying to kill you, but it's Christmas Eve and we're all Christians who celebrate the same holiday for the same reasons. Singing together doesn't mean we've forgotten we're enemies. It means we remember we're human beings first and soldiers second." This philosophy reflected American capacity to separate military necessity from personal hatred in ways that German military culture had rarely achieved. We'd been taught to hate our enemies personally and completely, to view them as obstacles to be destroyed rather than as human beings who happen to wear different uniforms. The American approach seemed more pragmatic and perhaps more humane, fighting fiercely when necessary, while maintaining recognition that enemies possessed the same fundamental humanity as Allied soldiers. This allowed Americans to conduct war professionally without the consuming hatred that German ideology had demanded. My education in American culture and values continued through the winter of 1944-1945 as I remained in various POW facilities while Allied forces completed Germany's defeat. But I never forgot that Christmas Eve, when enemy soldiers sang my Christmas carol in my language and invited me to join them in celebrating our shared faith despite the conflict that had made us enemies. When I was finally repatriated to Germany in 1946, I carried with me not just memories of American military superiority, but understanding of American cultural depth and spiritual awareness that German propaganda had never acknowledged. The Americans who defeated us weren't cultural barbarians, I told other returning veterans. They were people who valued family, faith, and tradition as much as we do. They sang Stille Nacht in German because they recognized that some things transcend national boundaries and military conflicts. This recognition influenced my post-war life as I worked to rebuild German civil society and to promote reconciliation between former enemies. The memory of Americans and Germans singing together on Christmas Eve 1944 became symbolic of the possibility for former enemies to recognize their common humanity and to build peaceful relationships based on shared values rather than continued hatred. In 1950, I had the opportunity to visit the United States as part of a cultural exchange program, and I specifically sought to meet American veterans who'd served in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. "Hoffman," said Colonel Patterson, a former company commander who'd been present during that Christmas Eve singing, "I'm glad you remember that night as positively as we do. Our captain organized that singing because he believed that maintaining our own humanity during war was as important as defeating our enemies militarily." He paused, pulling out a photograph from 1944 that showed American soldiers gathered near the prisoner compound. "We took this picture on Christmas Eve right before we started singing. Some of the men in this photo didn't survive the war. They were killed in the fighting after Christmas. But they spent their last Christmas Eve singing carols with German prisoners because they believed that was the right thing to do." His words reminded me that the American soldiers who'd sung with us that night had been facing their own mortality and uncertainty, had been scared and cold and far from home, just like we German prisoners had been. They'd chosen to reach out across the divide of war and hatred to share something beautiful with their enemies, even though doing so couldn't change the strategic situation or end the fighting. "Colonel Patterson," I said, "that Christmas Eve singing changed my understanding of American people and American values. I'd been taught that you were cultural inferiors without spiritual depth, but you demonstrated more grace and humanity than I'd ever witnessed from my own officers." Our conversation continued for hours, comparing experiences and perspectives on the Battle of the Bulge and broader questions about how former enemies could build peaceful relationships after years of trying to destroy each other. The final validation of what I'd learned that Christmas Eve came in 1984, 40 years after the event, when German and American veterans organized a joint commemoration of the Battle of the Bulge at the site of the prisoner compound where we'd sung together. "Hoffman," said an elderly American veteran who'd been one of the soldiers singing that night, "do you remember the words to Silent Night in German? I still remember some of the pronunciation you guys taught us when we sang together." His memory after 4 decades demonstrated how profoundly that moment had affected American participants as well as German prisoners. We'd created something together that transcended the temporary circumstances of our meeting and had become a permanent memory of grace in the midst of warfare. As darkness fell on that December evening in 1984, German and American veterans gathered at the site of the old prisoner compound and sang Stille Nacht together again, no longer as enemies, but as old men who shared memories of youth and war and a Christmas Eve when enemies had recognized their common humanity through shared music. This was my story. Feldwebel Ernst Iron Wolf Hoffman, who learned that enemies could recognize each other's humanity through shared culture and shared faith, that music could create bridges where words failed, and that sometimes the most profound moments of grace occurred not through victory or defeat, but through recognition that we were all human beings seeking meaning in circumstances beyond our control. My experience of that Christmas Eve taught me that cultural heritage transcended national boundaries, that faith could unite people whom politics divided, and that the memory of enemies singing together could inspire decades of efforts to build peace between nations that had tried to destroy each other. What struck you most about enemies singing Silent Night together on Christmas Eve during the Battle of the Bulge? Have you heard similar stories about moments of shared humanity during warfare? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual moments of grace can transcend the hatred and violence that define military conflicts. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing another story about how music, faith, and shared culture can create unexpected connections between enemies. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.